Hey everyone, Sebastian here. I just wanted to let everyone listening know that today's episode is going to be featuring some graphic descriptions of violence and cannibalism. If you are sensitive to that kind of thing, or you're listening with younger people who may not be ready for that kind of content, then you may want to sit this one out. For everyone else, please enjoy the show. There's a story that in the mid-1800s, a mountain man found himself made a prisoner by warriors from the Blackfoot tribe. The traveler had been heading west with a load of whiskey that he had hoped to sell to a group of Salish people. But the journey was stopped short when a group of Blackfoot warriors happened to cross his path. When they saw the burly Euro-American, they knew who he was instantly. This man had spent the last few years of his life engaged in a horrific blood feud with the Crow tribe. He had killed countless Crow tribespeople, often scalping the bodies as part of a years-long, near-genocidal quest to avenge the death of his wife. This was a dangerous man, but the Blackfoot party had him outnumbered. They were able to overpower him and bind his hands. The plan was simple. The Blackfoot would send word to the Crow tribe that they had captured their mortal enemy. Surely they would be able to trade him for a rich ransom, or at the very least, they would put the Crow people forever in their debt. We're told that night the Blackfoot group made a camp and posted a single guard to watch their prisoner. Meanwhile, the rest of the group dipped into the whiskey that they had commandeered from the captured mountain man. The prisoner watched all of this and bided his time, until it seemed like his captors were reasonably drunk and distracted. Then, he made his move. Using his great strength, he managed to free himself from the ropes that bound his hands. He then overpowered the one man who had been set as his guard and killed him on the spot. He then scalped the body, and even more gruesomely, cut off one of his victim's legs. Now, how he did this without drawing the attention of the other Blackfoot men is anyone's guess. But we're told that after completing his grisly work, the prisoner made good his escape, and he brought along that severed leg. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why, oh why, did this maniac feel the need to cut off a dead man's leg and carry it with him while making a difficult cross-country escape on foot? Well, the answer is that this wasn't just any mountain man. This was Liver-Eating Johnson. On top of his reputation as a ferocious killer, Johnson was a known cannibal. Over the course of his vendetta with the Crow tribe, he had taken to eating the livers of the men he had slain. He had no compunctions about eating human flesh, and after escaping from the Blackfoot group, he had a nearly 200-kilometer journey ahead of him through the wilderness. The severed leg was going to be a source of protein. This wasn't just some ghastly trophy. This was a meal plan. But the leg would end up being even more useful than Johnson could have ever predicted. While trekking across the wilderness back to the nearest settlement, Johnson took refuge in a cave, only to discover that it was already the home of an angry bear. We're told that the bear ferociously attacked Johnson, but the indomitable mountain man could not be stopped by neither man nor beast. He took what was left of that human leg, and he beat the bear into submission. Liver-Eating Johnson would live to fight another day. Now, that is quite a story. Could any of that possibly be true? Well, if you were to ask the authors of the 1958 biography of Johnson, entitled Crow Killer, they would say, absolutely. That biography presented liver-eating Johnson as a nearly superhuman figure whose quest for vengeance at times dipped into a type of cannibalistic mania. They presented this information with a straight face and with the implication that everything you were reading was 100% historically accurate. In fact, if you check the Wikipedia page for liver-eating Johnson, you will find many of the stories from Crow Killer repeated verbatim, with the 1958 book dutifully cited in the footnotes. But, as you might have guessed, there are many good reasons to doubt almost everything written in Crow Killer. The stories about liver-eating Johnson that often get presented as historical facts can defy credulity and common sense. Fighting a bear with a severed leg that he'd just been using as a snack is just the tip of the crazy iceberg. Despite the fact that so many of the stories about this 19th century mountain man seem completely unbelievable, the image of Johnson presented in Crow Killer has remained stubbornly lodged in our popular historical consciousness. To unpack the life and legend of liver-eating Johnson, I needed some help. So today I have brought on a guest to help me make sense of one of the Old West's most homicidal figures. Joining me is the one and only Daniele Bolelli, host of the podcast History on Fire. Can Daniele offer some insight into the unbelievable life of liver-eating Johnson? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 166, Who Was Liver-Eating Johnson? Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, this is just a reminder that an ad-free version of the show is available through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory to get access to an ad-free feed and a buttload of other great extras. You can also support the show by getting yourself some Our Fake History merch at our TeePublic store. Get yourself a cool-looking t-shirt, mug, tote bag, or even a little sticker featuring the one-of-a-kind episode art created by our resident artist, Frank Fiorentino. Follow the link at ourfakehistory.com or go to tpublic.com/stores/our-fake-history. This week, we are going to be welcoming the one and only Daniele Bolelli back to the show. He's here to help us make some sense of the murderous legend of the 19th century mountain man, liver-eating Johnson. Those of you out there who are deep in the world of history podcasts surely know the name Daniele Bolelli. Daniele is the creator of History on Fire, one of the finest history podcasts on the internet. History on Fire was launched the same year as Our Fake History, albeit with a bit more fanfare as Daniele was a bit more established in the public eye than I was back then. Apart from being a podcaster, Daniele is also a college professor and the author of a number of books, including On the Warrior's Path, Create Your Own Religion, and the 2015 memoir Not Afraid. On top of all of that, Daniele is an accomplished martial artist. In fact, the last time he joined me on Our Fake History was back in Season 6 when I did a series examining the mythical origin stories of several different Asian martial arts. But unless you have been paying for a Luminary subscription, then you may have noticed that Daniele's podcast feed has been a little quieter over the past few years. History on Fire became part of the Luminary podcast network a few years back, which meant that for a little while, the vast majority of History on Fire episodes were only available to subscribers. But just a few months ago, History on Fire dramatically reemerged from behind the paywall. So that means that History on Fire is once again available on all of the free podcast apps. So, if you stopped subscribing to his podcast, well, now is the time to resubscribe. Anyway, while Daniele was creating his show for the Luminary audience, he ended up making an episode on liver-eating Johnson that, at the time, even he admitted was basically an Our Fake History episode. He had assumed that many of the stories about liver-eating Johnson were true, until he started the research. And then he realized that the real story was about how this bloody legend took shape and then grew to mythical proportions. Now, obviously, that's normally the kind of thing that I tackle on this show. Well, because Daniele is a truly beautiful and generous person, he not only gave Our Fake History a robust shout-out on that show, he also offered to come on this podcast and essentially share his work. It was such a great offer that I could not refuse him, and the liver-eating Johnson story is certainly one that simply must be told. So, Daniele joined me a few days ago from his home in California for a conversation about the life and legend of liver-eating Johnson. It was very gracious of Daniele to join me for as long as he did, and our conversation ended up going in some really interesting directions. Honestly, I could listen to his wonderful Italian accent all day long. All right, so let's take a quick break, and when we return, you will hear my conversation with Daniele Bolelli. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Shopify. Can we talk about notifications for a second? Who actually leaves those sounds on anymore? Well, besides that kind. That's another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform to start, run, and grow your business. Shopify makes it simple to sell to anyone from anywhere. Whether your thing is vintage t-shirts or recipes for ghee, start selling with Shopify and join the platform simplifying commerce for millions of your favorite businesses worldwide. With Shopify, you can create your own online store that fits your vibe, you can discover new customers, and grow the following that keeps them coming back. Shopify makes selling simple, so you can put yourself and your ideas out there. Whether your thing is making ebooks or earrings, Shopify makes your success possible. So, sign up for a free trial at shopify.com/fake. That's fake, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/fake to start selling online today. Shopify.com/fake. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Cabinets to Go. Do people see your kitchen and say, wow? If not, then you need to visit cabinetstogo.com to request their free custom 3D design and quote for a kitchen makeover that wows for a whole lot less than you'd think. As seen on HGTV's Dream Home, cabinets2go.com is your one-stop shop renovation destination. They have everything you need from design to installation, with 200,000 cabinets available and ready to ship. Your wow kitchen can be complete in weeks, not months. Now, one thing that I think is cool about cabinets.com is how it does this 3D design process for you. So you really get to see your kitchen with new cabinets before you order them. I don't know. It's something I would like if I was getting new cabinets for my home. So right now, get a full custom 3D design of your new kitchen at cabinets2go.com/OFH. That's a free custom 3D design of your new wow kitchen at cabinets2go.com/OFH. Daniele, welcome back to Our Fake History. It's amazing to have you back on the show.
Thanks, man. It's always a treat to get to chat with you.
Yeah. So a few months back on History on Fire, you did this amazing episode on liver eating Johnson. And in that episode, you pointed out that it was kind of a perfect Our Fake History topic. And as I listened to that show, I'm like, oh man, I can't believe you got to that one before I could. So it's been great that you've agreed to come on the show and share the story of liver eating Johnson with the listeners of Our Fake History. So thanks again.
Of course, I felt like I was feeling mildly guilty doing that episode because the more I researched, the more I was like, oh, this is a perfect Sebastian story. This is exactly what
It,
he does because it was just too on the nose perfect for your style. So as I was doing that, I was like, oh man, I feel bad.
no, don't feel bad because it's such a good story. And like all of these historical myths that I explore on this show, sometimes the most interesting part is where the legend came from. The anatomy of the myth
Mhm.
is almost as interesting as the legend itself. Now, in this case, that's saying something because the legend is absolutely bananas,
Yes.
and we'll get into it. So, let's go through it. Let's start from the beginning.
Hmm.
Um, the legend of Liver Eating Johnson was born out of the experiences of the so called mountain men of the
Yep.
19th century. Can you give us a little background on who the mountain men were and why they inspired such popular legends?
Sure. The whole story of the mountain man, in a way, begins before they were even called mountain man, and it begins in the late 1500s, 1600s, and then the part that we see with Liver Eating Johnson is when they are properly known as mountain men into the early 1800s, and it really begins with the fur trade itself, because one of the things that happened in North America is that whereas in Europe, so much of the natural environment had been wiped out by a few centuries of civilization. North America did not have that problem. There were these never ending forests all over the place. There were lots and lots of animals inhabiting those forests all over. And why was this important? Because there was a lot of demand for furs in Europe, for clothing and other things, primarily for clothing, but there was not that much supply. I mean, there will be, completely on a side note, like the Russians will do some fur trading in Siberia, for example,
Mhm.
and getting into the whole business. But really, there wasn't enough supply in Europe to satisfy the demand. So, what in particular early on the French figured out was that there was money to be made in North America, not necessarily by conquering land, not by starting an empire, but by establishing trading partnerships with Native American tribes, where they would trade European goods in exchange for furs. And then that's how kind of the whole thing started. The fur trade became one of the driving forces of contact between natives and Europeans in North America, starting in the late 1500s, continuing in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. And what happened, of course, is that as the fur trade, because that's the way good old capitalism works, is that, whereas in traditional hunting, you would hunt until you have enough to eat and you have some extras, but eventually you stop because you want the animal numbers to be able to bounce back. In a capitalist system, there's never enough because the idea is you can always add more money in the bank. So the pressure was to keep up the hunting all the time. to a point where some of these animal species, in particularly beaver, for example, did not have a
Mhm.
chance to bounce back. So what would happen is that if you start doing this on the Atlantic coast, within a few years, close to the Atlantic coast, the forest would get kind of wiped out of those animal species that were used for furs. So then you push a little more inland, and then a little more inland, and by the 1800s, by the time we are talking about, you had these guys, the mountain men, who were usually Anglo-American, sometime French, sometime of British descent, sometime you name it, all kind of people who got into the business, going into the Rocky Mountains, because that's by then that's where the fur trading frontier had pushed, and essentially living by hunting all year long. And then when in spring came, they would just have these big rendezvous where they get together and sell their furs and make
Mhm.
the money for the year. Needless to say, it's a highly romanticized profession because it very much represented these all uber independent, tough guys who went alone in the wilderness with a knife and a gun, spent the year there, essentially at the mercy of the elements. Because if you break a leg, there was nobody else who could fix you. There was no doctor. There was no nothing. So the notion was these guys were these Marvel comic book characters who could throw a knife 100 yards away, kind of completely impossible things. All the legends that pop up
Yeah.
become ridiculous because the characters sort of are set up for that. They objectively did some really tough stuff, and so then the legends often grew about them.
Yeah, these guys are actually huge figures in Canadian history. It's one thing we actually learn quite a lot about when you do history education in Canada, because
Mhm.
the fur trade was so essential to the establishment of Canada as a colonial uh, holding for first the French and then the British. And so there's a lot of really romantic figures that come out of that in Canadian history, especially from Quebec. So there were these figures known as the voyageurs or the coureurs de bois, who were these early French fur traders who have become extremely romantic figures in Canadian history. And so, yeah, it seems like the mountain men were the sort of Anglo-American version of that in the Rocky Mountains in what is today the United States.
Absolutely. That was sort of the latest incarnate. That's why, when I say it started in the late 1500s, that was not the mountain men, but it was essentially the ancestors of the mountain men. Started
Right.
primarily, as you said, with the French. And the French went about it a bit of a different way. They really integrated with native people much more so than
Hmm.
some of the Anglos will, even though even then, some of them knew that there was no other chance but to make friends with local native tribes. Otherwise, you would die before the year was over. And also, you would have trading partners. So, not only the hunting that you do, but you also trade for furs with tribes that are doing their own hunting.
Right. Right. So, of these mountain men, the one that becomes one of the most famous over time is Liver Eating Johnson.
Yes.
So, okay. In your original episode, you talked about this 1958 book called Crow Killer
Hmm.
that purported to be a completely factual biography of liver eating Johnson. Now, as you break down in that show, Crow Killer is highly unreliable, but it does sort of give us the, let's call it the canonical myth of liver eating Johnson. So, can you give us the highlights of the mythical biography of liver eating Johnson?
Yeah, and believe it or not, the funny thing is that when I started the research in my naivete, and I should have known better, really, I actually thought this is the real tale. I thought the
Sure.
legend was based on reality. And then, it didn't take long once I started digging to realize that pretty much the whole thing is made up. I mean, there was a real guy named Leverett Johnson. He was a mountain man. I don't want to say that that's where it stops, but pretty close to it.
Yeah.
The myth gets larger and larger by the second, and as we'll see, it doesn't quite check out. But basically, the story of Liberty Johnson, I always heard it as this epic revenge story
Hmm.
because there are 10 million details about it that are interesting, and you already mentioned the story of the frozen leg that probably should give you a clue that maybe it's not exactly 100% true. But like the big theme, the running theme of the Liver Eating Johnson story is that he supposedly married to a woman from the Salish tribe. And she was either pregnant or just recently had a kid when he went off hunting, leaving her at the cabin for the season. And by the time he came back, he found her murdered along with his kid. Again, kid either as fetus or as a young child, depending on the tales. And he does not take it well. And he sees somehow miraculously he finds a feather there that's supposed to belong to the attackers. That never mind that already is a bit of a weird one. It's like, how do you know that the feather was actually on somebody's head rather than just fell off from a bird? And how did it stay there in the weeks intervening between the attack and when Johnson comes back? But regardless, supposedly he finds out that the attackers were from the Crow tribe.
Mm-hmm.
And that should have given me a clue already, because the reality is that the Crow they have a famous for entertaining very good relations with Euro Americans. So
Sure.
that already was a little bit of a weird one. But in any case, to stick to the legend, what eventually happens is that Johnson goes into this one man war against the Crow tribe, and over the following many years, he started killing crows one after another. The crows supposedly even send 20 guys after him, that they all try to sort of get a name for himself for being the one who gets this guy. And not only he killed them, but the legend, and that's how he gets his nickname, is that he carved out their liver and ate it raw.
Right.
Um, the 20 guys very conveniently decide to take turns attacking him. They never attack all together. They feel that warrior honor requires to
Uh,
attack one at a
and
time. So,
And I have to say, I love that detail that like each of these guys from the Crow tribe like approaches him one by one, because then it really does seem like like one of those old samurai movies. Before we got on here, we were talking a little bit about samurai, but
yeah.
have you seen the Lone Wolf and Cub movies, Daniele?
No, I haven't seen the movies.
Oh, do yourself a favor and watch Lone Wolf and Cub.
I shall.
Just like these classic samurai films, but like the bad guys that are always coming for this wandering samurai usually come one by one, which is very polite of them. But that seems like the liver eating Johnson story basically plays out the same way.
Yeah, 100%. It's like a video game, right? It's like if all the characters in the video game all they attack you at once, your video gaming experience ends rather quickly. They usually are very politely take turns in going one after another, so you can take care of business. It's yeah, essentially you have these crows lining up to get killed by Liberty Johnson in a way that again should have clued me that something was off, but the funny thing too, in the way the story is told, is that the numbers get downright ridiculous. Like
Mhm.
when you add it all up, the number of crow he killed supposedly is, I mean, by himself, he would have pretty much destroyed the whole crow tribe. In the
Sure.
sense that the tribe itself wasn't that huge. You're talking about a few thousand people all in all. And if you think about him supposedly killing hundreds, it's like that would make a dent that would destroy pretty much their tribe by himself.
Right.
That clearly, the fact that in Crow oral history, that's not even a bleep on the radar. There's nothing about this one man war with this guy. That's one of the things that reveal, okay, something is off here.
Yeah, and that's actually what I wanted to ask you about, right? So, the legend is, huge. It's peppered with these like tales about him, cutting off a man's leg and like using it to fight a bear,
Hmm.
rounding up, other mountain men to make these sort of genocidal raids on Crow camps. But you just mentioned that in Crow oral history, there's absolutely nothing about this.
Hmm.
So, what else should make us skeptical of what you might read in the book Crow Killer?
And by the way, if I want to throw one more thing on the Crow stuff, there's Joe Madison Crow, who's a fascinating figure in his own right. He was the last man to be considered a war chief for the Crow tribe. And he achieved all that during World War II by doing a series of deeds that any Crow warrior to be acknowledged as a war chief would have to go through, including stealing horses from an enemy, which not the easiest thing to do during World War II, but in any case, Joe Madison Crow, very, very fascinating figure. He was one of the main tribal historians for the tribe at the time.
Hmm.
And when they asked him about the Liver Eating Johnson story, he said, well, we do have tales that our ancestors traded with this guy. They would have a party and they would enjoy some deer liver together. So, it's a slightly different version of the story.
Yeah.
But that's what he said, that there's nothing else there.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, I was just thinking about like the difference between that and the sort of superhero version or maybe super villain version
Mhm.
of Liver Eating Johnson. The finding the feather at the scene of the murder, that in itself is almost like one of his superpowers because he is this like mountain man with apparently these amazing hunting skills. The idea
Mhm.
to like just like pick up a single feather and know exactly where it came from and how it got there is, something that an outsider might sort of, imagine a perfect hunter could do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's not unusual for mountain men. They do say it about him. There were plenty of mountain men who supposedly could smell a drop of blood 2 miles away. They could follow tracks left behind a month before. They could do all these things that,
Mhm.
of course, they are based on a little bit of reality, in the sense that if you took somebody out of a city in the 1800s and you threw them in the middle of the wilderness, the abilities of the mountain men to be good trackers or to be in tune to, you hear a certain noise, you know what's coming long before than a city person would, or, they clearly knew their craft. They could survive there. So there was this element that from somebody who didn't know anything, it looks like magic.
Yeah.
But let's
Yeah.
keep it real, It's like, so that tale tend to be, somebody goes, "Wow, that's amazing," and the next time they tell the tale, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and before long, exactly, they turn into Marvel comic books.
Right. Right. Um, okay. So just to get some closure on the myth. So, the origin story is that like his wife and child or his wife or his pregnant wife
Yeah.
is killed by a group of people from the Crow tribe. He goes on this massive killing spree, sometimes killing individual warriors, sometimes killing large groups with a posse he's rounded up. How does it end? How does the Liver Eating Johnson story wrap up?
So eventually, what happens is he kills enough, has a meeting with the crows, who surprisingly don't murder him on the spot. Say,
Right.
hey guys, are we done? Are we? I'm good with it. My revenge is over. Are you guys good? And they're like, yeah, totally. We would love to be your friend. And it ends there. Which
Right.
even that is slightly funny, but
Yeah, yeah, just like, and again, that's the funny thing about these types of stories. When you say that they're historical, you can kind of give them sort of a crappy ending like that, right?
right.
Like if it was a proper piece of historical fiction, the author would come up with something a little bit more satisfying. But because your authors are saying, "Oh no, this is true," you can say like, and then they got together and shook hands, and the beef was squashed.
Yeah, essentially that's what they say, which is, it raises a lot of questions in itself. But yes, that's how they make it sound.
Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Indeed. Hiring well means getting past preconceived ideas and recognizing top talent. How do you do it? You need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Something that's awesome about Indeed is that it makes hiring all in one place so easy because of their great screening and assessments tool. Indeed helps you see your top talent's ability in a flash by adding any of the 135 graded assessment tests to your job posts. Indeed knows when you're growing your business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Visit Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory. Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory. Terms and conditions apply. Okay, so there's the mythological Johnson. So, what do we know for sure about this guy? Who or what are the reliable sources on this man's life?
Not a whole lot. I mean, there are some articles written while he was alive. Keep in mind that journalism back then wasn't exactly huge on fact checking, so they did report lots of legends themselves, but they are, slightly more reliable. We do have some contemporary accounts. We do have even pictures of him when he was alive. So,
Mhm.
as thin as that evidence is, that's considerably more than you can say, for example, about the founders of most modern religions, or really most people. Most people you do not have pictures when they were alive. You do with him. We know that he was born somewhere in the 1820s, probably 1824. We know that he died by 1900, and that by then his life was a little more well documented. So we do know that part. The rest, of course, start getting a little thinner, the evidence, but it seems to be that he made a career early on. He ran away from home because he lived in a fairly abusive household early on and started working on hunting whales. Hunting whales back then was a huge business in the early to mid 1800s, and like it was the third largest industry in Massachusetts in the 1840s, for example. And
Mhm.
apparently, a young Johnson got into the business and was part of it. Okay, so far so good. He may or may not, depending on where you hear. Again, this is newspaper articles from the time. He may have participated in the Mexican-American War, 1846, 1848. Um, and then we do know that he became a mountain man. Then the next historical record, like Mexican American War ends in 1848. The next thing we know that for sure in the historical record is from the 1870s. So that's 20 plus years later, and where he pops up serving as a guide for some of the pioneers crossing the Midwest, trying to get to the West Coast. And then we just know that in 1876, just a few months after the Little Bighorn, he joins the soldiers. They were tracking down the Lakota and Cheyenne who had defeated Custer and Crook at the Little Bighorn and the Battle of the Rosebud, and he's essentially a scout for General Miles. So again, not a lot of clear-cut events that we know for sure. After serving in some of these campaigns under Miles, he'll serve in another one against the Nez Perce. He later he will end up joining one of the traveling. Back then, toward the end of the 1800s, there were several Wild West shows. The most famous ones being, of course, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. That was sort of the number one. But there were many others that tried and often failed to do the same thing. And after that, he became a sheriff in Montana, got old and died. That's more or less what we know.
So, one thing that really struck me with what you just said is that there's sort of a blank spot in his chronology, right? We know that
Yes.
he was born in the 1820s, and then he sort of reappears in the records in the 1870s. that blank spot is right around the time he was supposedly fighting that one man war with the Crow. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. So theoretically, one could say, well, the official newspaper clippings got that part right, the other things, but they miss all that happened in between, and so the story is still true. It's not, but one could try to make that argument at least initially.
Right on. Yeah. No. Well, one thing I'm really fascinated by is how legends like this start to grow and how they take shape. In your show on Johnson, you used a great quote from the author DJ Herda on the anatomy of historical myths. And I really wanted you to share that with our listeners. Do you have that at hand?
Yeah, I got it right here from my notes. So he says, in real life, the more absurd it sounds, the less likely it is to have happened. Unfortunately, in the building of legends, just the opposite is true. The less rational it sounds, the more likely it is to have occurred. After all, we're not talking about everyday mortals here. We're talking about supernovas, about men and women who are gods and goddesses, about people who do no wrong, doing what is right regardless of the personal cost or sacrifice. What's important to realize when winnowing through the fields of time is that legends get perpetuated because their very perpetuation serves a purpose. Whether or not all the stories are true, untrue, or somewhat basically just a little bit in between true and untrue, that's the historian's quagmire when writing about historical figures.
I love that. I love that because that could basically be the mission statement of our fake history.
Right? He captures it perfectly. That's why when reading this stuff, I was like, your name was in my ear over and over.
Oh, well, just like that thought that, the more that more that it strains credulity, the less rational it is, the more it should make you skeptical. And yet, with legend, the crazier the tale is, the more likely it is to be repeated and it takes on a power all its own. The repetition itself is often sort of mistaken for a type of proof or authenticity.
You know what's funny is before we started recording, we were talking about video games, and
Yeah,
I was mentioning being mildly addicted to historical video games. And
right.
there's one of the various Assassin's Creed, there's this moment where you keep running into these hunters out in the middle of the wilderness, and you just sit down with them and have coffee and chit chat. And
Mhm.
every time they are telling like the craziest tales ever, and they tell you to go check up on them, and it's like, I swear I saw it. There's Bigfoot in that cavern, and then you go check it out and find out why that's not the case, and then and it happens like multiple times throughout the game, and it's almost the running joke where each time you run into the hunters, you're gonna hear things that have very little relation with reality, and it's pretty funny because it kind of captures the way many of these guys entertain themselves. They would get together by spring and they would start telling stories, some truthful, some embellishing, and some just going off on the deep end because it was fun, because it was
Right.
entertaining to tell these stories.
Right. Well, yeah. So it seems like the liver eating Johnson story sort of begins as a campfire story told by mountain men about a real guy, but just like exaggerated stories about a real guy. But in Johnson's case, it seems like his career as a Wild West show performer is really key to understanding the growth of his legend. So, can you break that down for us? How did he get involved in the Wild West shows? Or maybe we should start with what were the Wild West shows? And once Johnson got involved with them, how did those shows shape the persona of liver eating Johnson?
Well, basically, the Wild West shows were cinema before cinema existed. Before you had movies, you had to entertain people somehow. And the Wild West shows were a mix of theater, circus, historical reenactment, and probably you can check a few more boxes. They would grab a bunch of performers, ideally people who actually been involved in the events. So, for example, the most famous of all the Wild West shows, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show,
Mm-hmm.
hired all sort of famous Western legends. Like he even hired Sitting Bull for a while to do a tour. He
Yeah.
hired some of the participants in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He hired famous hunters. And these guys would then reenact some of the events that, like, they would do little skits trying to reenact, like, some natives would get together on horseback and they would chase bison around and they would kind of reenact what a bison hunt would have looked like.
Hmm.
Or you would have a family crossing the arena and they get attacked by natives and the cavalry arrive to save the day. They were essentially what a lot of Western movies will do as actual scenes later on.
Hmm.
They were putting on as live performances. Sometimes just telling stories, sometimes physically reenacting them on a grand scale in the middle of an arena with people around in the bleachers checking out the events. I mean, some of these became really big business. Buffalo
Hmm.
Bills got his show touring in Europe, all over US, even South America. It was Many of them never got to that scale, but they still toured in parts of the United States at least. And that's what happened with the ones that Johnson joined. He was a
Yeah.
smaller one that only traveled throughout the Midwest, never became really that much financially successful, and kind of died out. However, while he was on the tour, he did perform with many crows, and quite a few people think that the story of his rivalry with the crow was actually born from one of the skits where they would put on, where he would fight the crows. Never mind that that had never happened in real life. It was just one of the scenes of this Wild West show, kind of part of their performances.
See, that kind of blows my mind, right? That like in these shows, he was like, okay, well, we've got some guys here from the Crow tribe. How about there's a scene where I fight a bunch of you?
Yeah.
And then that goes down as a real event. As it's
Mhm.
like it's like if people thought that Christopher Walken like really walked into the room and was like, give me more cowbell, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
that really happened.
Yeah, so that's where things get a little, and realistically, when you look at the stories of the crows in particular, they picked any other tribe, it would have sounded slightly more believable. The
Right.
Crows had such a history of good relations with white folks that is very hard to sell that as a real story right off the bat. I mean, he just
Right.
picked the wrong tribe first and
But
foremost.
I mean, but that requires people to have an understanding of indigenous history, right?
Correct.
Like,
Correct.
and you are someone that has studied this stuff deeply, and the kind of cultural differences between the many groups that called that part of the world home.
Yeah.
But if you're someone that sees indigenous people as just this, homogenous group, then it's like, yeah, sure. What makes the Crow different from the Blackfoot people? Often people, or many of the people who these shows or later books were targeted at, weren't particularly interested in that.
Correct. That's exactly what's going on. This was just popular entertainment, and again, it's like almost trying to argue for the historical facts behind the Marvel comic book. It's like, no, it's a legend. In this case, it happens to be very loosely based on a real person, but it's entertainment, and that's kind of where it's at.
Right. And so even the nickname Liver Eating Johnson, obviously that makes for a much more entertaining thing to slap on a poster promoting your Wild West show.
Hmm.
Um, Now, in your show, you kind of got into the potentially mundane origins of that nickname. You mentioned something already about, Crow oral histories about that nickname. What did you learn about the origins of the nickname Liver Eating Johnson?
So there are three, four theories there. One, the crows are saying, we got together with this guy, ate a lot of deer liver, we all liked it. So, not the most exciting
Right.
story. Another one is a tale of a guy who was interviewed for a newspaper who said that they were hunting together at some point, and Johnson was known for being a pretty good with the gun, being a good sharpshooter, and he missed shooting an antelope several times. He
Mm.
got really mad and screamed at the antelope, I will eat your liver out if I do kill you. And then eventually managed to shoot the antelope that goes up and ate the liver. So that's another version of how he got the nickname liver eating.
Right.
Third version, slightly more dramatic, it involves a fight not with the Crows, but with the Lakota, where in 1868 he got into a fight. There was a fight between some mountain men, including Johnson, and some Lakota warriors. And in the course of the fighting, he killed the Lakota, and then he was kind of in close contact, so he actually stabbed him. And when he stabbed him, supposedly a piece of the guy's liver came out,
Mm.
and then he turned to another of his friends and said, "Hey, come on and have a piece. You will keep your stomach down for a while until we get home for dinner." And
Oof.
the other guy was like, "Keep that thing away from me. What the hell are you saying?" And then he put on a show, dancing around, saying, "Come on, it's as good as antelope's liver. Have a bite." And he
Oof.
pretended to have a bite. The other guy threw up, and then everybody laughed forever because he didn't really eat it, but he made it look like it. Nothing like murderous humor to cheer
Oh,
everybody up, I guess.
yeah. And that story is still pretty dark. Like he did just murder a man.
Yep.
Um, but it- perhaps that might just be the little kernel of truth at the heart of the liver eating Johnson story.
Could be. Could very well be. I mean, little odd in the sense that this battle is supposedly a big deal where, like, I forget the exact numbers, but like some 30 Lakota warriors got killed. Seemed to be a high number for it not to show up in story after story of the many, many, many books published about Lakota history with people from that time telling their, you would figure that that battle would show up somewhere. It doesn't.
Right.
Maybe it was a smaller affair. Maybe still did happen. It wasn't quite, and they inflated the numbers a little bit. Could be. It definitely could be, but we don't know for sure.
Right. So even the story that is perhaps, the most reliable is not all that reliable.
Yeah.
He probably was a guy that just liked eating deer and antelope liver, is what you're telling
Yeah.
me.
It's like, yeah, it could be anything, and then the legend is built on it. It starts with him eating some liver somewhere, and then it builds up on that. It could be, again, it could be this one about killing somebody and making a practical joke of it. It could be just as basic as him really enjoying eating raw liver from animals. Who knows?
Yeah, well, it also makes sense, again, going back to the Wild West show of it all, that, like, if one West show is we've got Calamity Jane, the other one would be like, oh yeah, well, we've got liver eating Johnson, right?
Exactly.
You needed a hook like that.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
That's
honestly fascinated by the Wild West shows, and the more we're talking about it, the more I'm thinking I actually need to do a full-on episode or series on Wild Bill or the Wild West shows in general, because the public historian in me is just fascinated by history as entertainment
yep.
and how, like, these early Wild West shows were essentially creating legend out of really recent history. Like, these events had, like, just taken place, or we're only like a few decades in the rear view, and already they're being memorialized in this like heightened and exaggerated way, and they were essentially creating this genre.
I feel the same way you do. I feel that the Wild West shows are an incredibly fascinating window on that time in history. I'm thinking of doing a series too, and I think it's good because the way you approach things and the way I approach things, even though sometimes we seem to be fascinated with similar topics, we
Yeah,
do have a little bit of a different flavor that we bring to it.
of
So
course.
I love when you cover them, even when it's stuff that I'm like, oh, I wanted to cover that. It's like, no, no, I like it because the way you go about it is slightly different, and I enjoy your style. So
Hmm.
I find it cool, and I think it's inevitable that for me that I'm so fascinated with the history of the American West, and for you being fascinated with this intertwining between real history and spectacle and legend.
Hmm.
Well, show is all of that. It has
Right.
everything, and it's incredible what you just said. The fact that it's so close to when the events are really taking place. I mean, you have in 1883, you already have reenactment of the Little Bighorn battles in some of the biggest Wild West shows that happened 7 years earlier. So a bunch of the people involved are still alive. Well, not Custer guys, but
Right.
many of the natives involved were still alive, and so it's really interesting, even because without giving away too much about what you may do on the series, one theme that I'm just gonna throw out there, and then I'm sure we'll both develop it when we get to telling that story.
Mhm.
The Wild West show was a complicated kind of thing because on one hand it's celebrating American conquest. There's no
Right.
argument about it. That it's a celebration of US conquering the land from coast to coast, manifest destiny and all that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it has a very nostalgic look at that life, including the native life,
Hmm.
in a way that clearly, like a guy like Buffalo Bill, for example, he was born for that life. He loved that life. He camped with natives all the time. Even when during the actual staging of the shows, he would always go sleep in the native camp, hang out with them. He loved the culture. He enjoyed it.
Hmm.
He did not want what was to come, kind of the civilization of the West. He enjoyed the old life, and so he's kind of stuck in between, on one hand, celebrating the end of their life that comes from this conquest by the US, while at the same time badly missing it. And that's why he's putting it on stage. So it's a very complicated thing in terms of what the
Yeah.
message of the Wild West show was, because he went in two directions, opposite directions at the same time.
And you know what? Again, I'm fascinated by that dynamic because what that seems like to me, and now I'm just going to speculate wildly here for everyone on the
Mhm.
show, but it seems like that's Wild, or I keep on calling him Wild Bill, sorry, Buffalo Bill,
Yep.
understanding what the meta narratives are in his culture, understanding what people sort of want to see about the American West, what they want to see about cavalrymen and mountain men and indigenous people. They want to see a certain sort of stereotype on stage, but then also like his personal experience pushing against that too, right? It's like the businessman versus him as a empathetic human being.
Yeah.
Um, and and it's just like sort of just understanding, like, as much as he was shaping those narratives with that show, he was also just reflecting narratives that were already in the air, right?
And for sure, there's that aspect. There's the business aspect. There's giving people what they want to hear, that kind of thing. And I also think there's an internal conflict in him because he did fight at some point on the side of the US cavalry as a scout.
Right.
And yet he clearly sympathized with natives in a lot of ways. So there's this very almost schizophrenic vibe there where he's one person in one context and is fighting against some of the things he values at the same time.
Yeah.
And he's almost, there are these two sides of him. One as a good old American boy who's doing what's supposed to be done for the United States, and the other who says, "Oh wait, time out. I actually enjoy this culture and lifestyle more than I enjoy what I'm paving the way for." So
Yeah.
it's this internal contradiction that I think went with his own values.
Yeah, I need to learn more about him because as we're talking about this, I'm like, oh yeah, this is everything I'm interested in. And also, I love a conflicted character, right? Like,
Mhm.
I love a person that is like deeply human, like that. That is like, did some things that are, cannot be defended, but then also you can see a kind of very relatable heart to them. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think that's what makes his Wild West show, beside being the biggest and most famous, different from others, because others were clearly exploitative things just to make a buck, screw everybody else involved, and run off with the money. He was not like that. Most of the natives who participated in the Wild West show spoke very approvingly of him. They said that he was always super nice to them, treated them well, and everything else. So it's interesting how it works out.
Yeah, I know we're on a huge tangent here, but I
It's a
just
good
couldn't
one.
help it. I couldn't help it.
Yeah.
All right, so taking it back to Liberating Johnson, you know, from a 2022 perspective, it's hard not to see the racism at the heart of these stories.
Mhm.
As we were talking about before, the indigenous people in the stories are presented as the worst stereotype of a sadistic savage. In Crow Killer, you know, all of his foes are like mowed down like faceless henchmen. We were talking about them being like characters in a video game. I was thinking they were kind of like the stormtroopers in Star Wars who can never properly get a shot off at the heroes, but they just dutifully fall down dead on cue. My point is, there isn't much humanity given to indigenous people in these stories. Now, you've studied indigenous people in the American West quite closely. How does the liver eating Johnson story fit within bigger narratives about indigenous people in the American West, in your opinion?
I mean, it's definitely part of those, we good, strong Americans need to get rid of these godless savages kind of vibe.
Yeah,
And, you know, that's where it's at. Even his supposed alliances with some tribes, which would have been inevitable being a mountain man in that place, and the legend does present him being friendly with some tribes here and there, they still seem to be mainly an excuse so that he can go back to killing his enemies and just giving a remote sense of realism to a legend that otherwise would already barely stands. But at least you say, okay, he traded with this tribe and was friendly with them, so he was shielded by a revenge attack by this guy on this one occasion, and he actually had some men with him or things like that. But for the most part, yeah, they do seem it's classic. I mean, if you think about it, it's classic Western movies pre 1960s, where save for
sure.
a few occasions, natives are there so that John Wayne can arrive at the last moment, fire off a shot, four natives fall off the horse at the same time, that kind of thing. It's
Right.
just where they are the orcs from in Lord of the Rings. They are just there so that the hero can kill them and look very heroic. They are like the dragon in the legend type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I mean, finally, we've kind of come to a spot where we're sort of trying to understand more of things from the indigenous perspective. And what I what I love about what you've sort of told us is that what stuff we do have from the crow is like so gentle by comparison, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny. That's one thing that I actually get into, and is again, not to go on a different tangent, but it's something that I've been very, very fascinated with. Is the fact that we seem to, in the way history is told, we seem to switch from stereotype to stereotype, because
Sure.
for the longest time these were the popular stereotypes, just flat out racist stereotypes about indigenous peoples. Then it became a post 1960s thing of these guys can do no wrong. They hug the furry creatures of the forest. They spend their days having visions and
Right.
being gentle and kind. And it's like, not exactly. That's not real human beings either. Rather than figuring out, okay, one is a overly romanticized stereotype, one is a racist stereotype. Let's look at reality. The reaction to the over romanticized stereotype has been to go back to the racist stereotypes. Like, if you look at a lot of
Right.
popular books about indigenous cultures written in the last 10 to 15 years, they are packed with racist stereotypes presented as, oh, I just don't want to present a politically correct version of history. I'm after the reality of it. And it's like, no, you're not
Right.
after the reality. You're just buying back into the thing that created the backlash that brought on a more politically correct version. You're going back to, and I'm amazed at the fact that people don't explicitly write, I'm writing a racist book on the cover, somehow gives them a
Right.
pass and people take it as actual history. Because there are a lot of famous books written these days that are re embracing that thing from beginning to end. And I'm blown away that they can still pass as history today.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's something that I think a lot about when I'm creating my show. Is you want to be balanced and you want to be thoughtful, and you don't want to sort of like indulge in a stereotype in any direction that's going to give people a skewed idea of the past. But
Mhm.
I think we're always best led when we just think about people's humanity first, right? Like,
Yeah.
as long as you really engage with them as human beings and remember that human beings are capable of those infinite levels of both, humility and grace, as well as horrific violence, then all of a sudden we can get a more nuanced picture of who everyone was in this world.
Yeah, and I think it's I mean, just to give an example so people understand what we're talking about, like there was a biography of Red Cloud that I read, written not so long ago and very popular, that contained a line. I'm paraphrasing because I'm not in, like, I don't have the quote in front of me, but was something along the lines of, like, oh, Red Cloud possessed the unusual forethought for an Indian. Like,
Right.
I'm sorry,
Right.
try again. What is like he's essentially saying Red Cloud was actually smart, which was strange for an Indian. And that
Yeah.
was a line from a book written in the last few years, very popular, sold all over the place. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what? Time
Yeah.
out.
And like, that's, I mean, how did that get past anyone? Like, that's just like, that is like, yeah, wearing its racism on its sleeve. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
like, give me a break. I can't even believe that.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
stuff like that is where you're like, okay, I guess. And I do see it a lot. You know, it seems to me like in many different fields, you get this ping pong game between bad ideas that rather than realizing, okay, this one was off, this one was off, let's try to find what actually works, is this one was off, I don't like it, so I'm just going to go back to the other idea that was off. And it's like, okay, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, speaking of ideas that are off, I
Hmm.
think the liver eating Johnson story combines a lot of these ideas all together. In your show, you talked about how Crow Killer and the liver eating Johnson legend in general is shaped by this bigger literary trope. And this literary trope sometimes gets called the white Indian trope.
Yep.
Can you explain what that is and how it may have shaped the liver eating Johnson story?
So it kind of revolves around the paradox of civilization, because the thing is, if you read even writings like by Theodore Roosevelt, for example, on one hand there's this admiration of civilization, and on the other hand there's this sense that we are missing something in becoming overly civilized. It probably is the same thing that Buffalo Bill was feeling. It's probably the same thing that created literary things like The Last of the Mohicans. There's this desire to, okay, let me actually backtrack 1 second. It boils down to one fact, that being civilized the way these guys saw it was on one hand a necessity, but then they saw it as, well, these guys who are more in touch with nature, who are tougher, who carve out a living out of the land, they are manlier, tougher, possess instincts that none of the city people do. So there was this admiration for what was seen as this more Spartan-like life. And so they are caught in between. On one end, cheerleading for advancing civilization, and on the other end, feeling like civilization is making people weak.
Right.
And so that's where the white Indian comes in, because on one level they are admiring what some indigenous people are capable of doing. But on the other hand, they cannot, because of racism, actually admire indigenous people. So they have to come
Right.
up with somebody who's white enough to be one of us. He has to be a good, civilized American, but he can speak the language that these guys speak. And I don't mean it literally as language, but a language of being a great hunter, a great tracker, a great fighter, all of that, just as well as they do, if not better.
Right.
And that's kind of where this literary thing comes up. And Last of the Mohicans is probably the classic example of that in
Sure.
literature. But without having made it to that level, there are a ton of legends that read almost identical to the liver eating one, of
Right.
some white guy either in the 1700s, in the 1600s, in the 1800s, who acts upon revenge because his family is killed by natives, and then become the greatest tracker hunter of them all and wreak havoc on a whole tribe. That seems to be an ongoing theme that shows up over and over again.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the idea that, like, you know, we're supposed to sort of root for liver eating Johnson in these stories is kind of crazy, right? Like the stories are so brutal and so violent, and yet we're almost supposed to cheer on his savagery.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, because really, when you read the books, like when you read some of the sources that made up the legend, they do they do read like torture porn pretty much. It's just
Sure.
like murder after murder after murder to a level that, don't get me wrong, I mean, I consume my fairly heavy amount of very violent media, and it's still shocking. It's just like, Jesus, can we take a break for a page at least? Can we not have a grisly torture murder happening at every other line? And that
Right.
does not seem to be the case. That's what the legend is very much about.
Fair enough. Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking the legend of liver eating Johnson today. Daniele, I can't thank you enough for coming on, for sharing all of this research you did into this story with us here on Our Fake History, for indulging in my tangents and my flights of fancy. I always love talking to you, man. So thank you again for being on Our Fake History.
Yeah, man, you're. I think I told you once. You're the first time that my daughter heard a podcast that she liked was yours. So our fake history will forever remain in my household as an important mark because it's yours was the first one that she was like, "Hey, I actually like this story. I'm digging it." So I forget which particular episode it was, but yes, she was listening to your stuff and she enjoyed it. So I was like, "Okay, our fake history above all." Then.
I know she's a discerning critic, so that is high praise.
Yes. Thank you
Right
so
on,
much.
man. All right. Well, thanks again. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon. Okay, that's all for this week. Thanks again to Daniele Bolelli for joining us today on Our Fake History. Check out his podcast, History on Fire, wherever you get your podcasts. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. Before I go this week, I'd like to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to Britt Rule, to Christian Hayden, to Sharon Peplinski, to Michael Berkeley, to Hugh Chungus, to Cecilia M., to Blue LA, to Jen Mayer or Jen Meyer, to Scott Russell, to Sonia Howard, to Zaphod, and to We Love You, Triangulum. I like that one. All of these wonderful people have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon. So you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for your ongoing support. If you want to support on Patreon and get all the cool extras, go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. A number of you have been asking me about this new Graham Hancock Netflix show, and so I think I'm going to have to watch it and maybe record a little something for the patrons about that. So if you think you might be interested in that and all the other cool extras I've got there, then go to patreon.com. If you want to support the show and you don't have extra money, I get it. Podcasts are awesome because they are free. So maybe support the show by doing something like writing a nice review. Give us 5 stars on the apps that allow you to rate and review the podcast. Say some nice words. It means a lot. Also, just recommend us to your friends. That also helps out a whole lot. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook at facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Twitter while it's still going at ourfakehistory, and you can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. The theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real. One, two, three, four!
Hey, Friday Night Lights fans! It's Not Only Football, Friday Night Lights and Beyond is an episode-by-episode discussion of the hit TV series Friday Night Lights, hosted by yours truly, Scott Porter, who played Jason Street on the show, and my two wonderful co-hosts.
Me, Zach Guilford, a.k.a. Matt Saracen.
And me, May Whitman, a.k.a. someone who wasn't on the show but really, really loves it a lot.
We will also bring on some special guests, answer your questions, and tell you about what's going on in our lives today.
It's Not Only Football, Friday Night Lights and Beyond, coming soon wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose!